Hi, and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on chapter 14 on the Picture of Dorian Gray. This chapter picks up the morning after Basil's murder and how Dorian now carries forth the rest of his plan to cover up the murder. Remember, he spoke in chapter 13 of the consequences of what he'd done. People who do things like that are hanged every day. And so he, for his own welfare, needs to make sure that nobody finds out what has happened. And he has formulated a plan that involves another man, Alan Campbell, who we meet later on in the chapter. So when Dorian wakes up that next morning, he has this experience that maybe some of you have had before, when something momentous has happened the day before, something terrible or traumatic. But in those first few moments after you wake up, you don't necessarily remember what's happened, and you can be quite peaceful and happy, and then it slowly dawns on you. So this is what happens to Dorian. He slept quite peacefully, and he'd not dreamed at all. He'd actually had quite a peaceful night, which perhaps shows us his ability to decompartmentalize and to forget the fact that he's just killed his friend in cold blood. Anyway, gradually the events of the preceding night creep with silent blood-stained feet into his brain, and he winces at the memory. Now it's interesting, look at the wording used here. He winced at the memory of all that he had suffered. And then he recalls his loathing for Basil, which was the thing that sort of preempted him to kill Basil. But he's focused on himself. He thought of all that he had suffered. So the horribleness or the sense of uneasiness that he's feeling is not because of what he put Basil through or what he has done to Basil, but because of the trauma he himself has experienced. Very self-centered, egotistic, narcissistic, as we know Dorian has now become. Listen to the language here. The dead man was still sitting there too. Remember, he said the thing, he no longer referred to the body as Basil. The dead man was still sitting there now in the sunlight. Such things were too hideous for daylight. And so he needs to continue with his plan to now dispose of Basil's body. But he tries not to brood too much on what he's done. He says if he had brooded too much on what he'd gone through, he would sicken or grow mad. It was a thing to be driven out of the mind, to be drugged with poppies, which of course is what he tries in 2 chapters' time. So he wakes up and he goes downstairs and he writes 2 letters. One, rather significantly, he puts in his pocket, and the other one he hands to his valet. And this is a letter that he sent to Alan Campbell to summon him to come and see him. And so the time where he's waiting for Alan Campbell to arrive, he experiences quite a lot of anguish and anxiety. And so he tries to distract himself by sketching. At first he draws flowers and architecture, but then he starts drawing faces. And then it feels like to him as if every face he draws, has a fantastic likeness to Basil. So you can see that even though consciously he's trying not to think about what has occurred, it subconsciously creeps through and then becomes conscious. He was determined he would not think about what had happened until it became absolutely necessary that he should do so. And so he continues pacing up and down, but he cannot keep his mind from Basil. And when he does think specifically about Basil, he says, poor Basil, what a horrible way for a man to die. You see there the removal of himself from that equation. So he can see that Basil suffered, but he doesn't connect his actions with Basil's suffering. And the only time he thinks about his suffering is because what he's had to suffer through, the trauma that he has experienced. So his sympathy is nothing more than skin deep, I would say. Then he starts being concerned about Alan Campbell and why he's taking so long. And in his thoughts about Alan Campbell, it then gets revealed to the reader their history. Now, there's nothing specific. Every reference to what transpired between Dorian and Alan is only very obtusely referenced in this chapter. But because of what we know of Dorian already, most of us can connect the dots and come up with at least one or two plausible theories. So they had been great friends once. They were almost inseparable. There's a reference there to the intimacy, which had suddenly come to the end. And now when they meet in society, it's only Dorian Gray who smiled. Alan Campbell never did. So if Dorian's the one who smiles at him, but Alan doesn't smile, you can tell that it's probably Dorian who's hurt Alan. Now, Alan Campbell is a scientist, but he also had a great passion for music, and that was the thing that first drew them together. Music and that indefinable attraction that Dorian seemed to be able to exercise whenever he wished. Exercised often without being conscious of it, although I'm sure a lot of times he used it deliberately for his own gain. So for 18 months, their intimacy lasted. And so for Campbell, Dorian Gray was the type of everything that is wonderful and fascinating, but suddenly people remarked that they scarcely spoke when they met, and Campbell seemed always to go away early from any party at which Dorian Gray is present. So we know that this is a severed relationship, okay? And you wonder how on earth then Dorian is going to be able to convince somebody who seems to loathe him to actually help him. So as the minutes crept by, he became horribly agitated. At last he got up and began to pace, looking like a beautiful caged thing, taking long, stealthy strides, and his suspense becomes unbearable. Okay. And the reason he is so concerned, it says there, he knew what was waiting for him, saw it indeed, and shuddering, crushed with dank hands. So he's sweating, his palms are sweating, his burning lids as though he could have robbed the very brain of sight and driven the eyeballs back into their cave. So he is imagining his fate if he's not able to dispose of Basil's body. It's this dead body is, hanging around up in the attic, this sort of gothic scene of the horrible thing upstairs. It used to be the portrait, now it's Basil's body. So Alan Campbell arrives, and Dorian thanks him for coming, but Alan, from the get-go, is very standoffish. And obviously, I mean, he leaves parties when Dorian's there, so why on earth would Dorian want to speak to him? He speaks with slow deliberation, and there was a look of contempt in the steady gazing search that he turned on Dorian. And so Dorian asks for his help, and he says, "You need to help me. It's a matter of life and death to more than one person." Obviously, it's a matter of life and death to Dorian, because if Dorian is found guilty of murder, he could be executed. So he says to Alan that there's a body in the top of his house. Now, that reveals to us clearly that obviously whatever he has on Alan Campbell, whatever information he holds about this man, it is enough to ensure the fact that he can tell Alan Campbell that there's a dead body in his house with the fair certainty. I mean, he wouldn't take this chance if he wasn't certain that he would be able to get Alan Campbell not only to help him, but to help him and not say anything about it. So he says, "Don't look at me like that. Who the man is, why he died, how he died are matters that concern you. What I need you to do is this." And of course, at the mention that Dorian needs Alan to do something for him, he declines. He says, "I decline to be mixed up. Keep your horrible secrets to yourself. They do not interest me anymore." Which hints there that he was once probably quite enamored with Dorian and his the things that made him tick. Now, the kind of superior tone, the condescending tone that Dorian takes here towards Alan is really interesting. He says, "I'm sorry for you, Alan, but I can't help myself. You're the one man who's able to help me. I'm forced to bring you into this matter. I have no option. You are scientific. You've got to destroy the thing that is upstairs, to destroy it so that not a vestige of it will be left." And of course, Alan says, "You're mad, Dorian." Now, when he says you're mad, Dorian, Dorian says, I was waiting for you to call me Dorian. Now, you call somebody by their first name if you know them very well, if you've been intimate. And it kind of hints at this, the connection that they had. And this almost like frisson of chemistry or attraction is hinted at when he calls him by his first name. And Dorian sort of smugly says, I was waiting for you to call me that. Now, when he first tries to explain the death of the man upstairs, he said it was suicide. And Alan Campbell immediately says, oh, I should fancy that you drove him to it. Okay. So this mirrors what Basil said in the preceding chapters, where he says that, you know, you ruin people. And Alan says the same thing. If this person committed suicide, you probably drove them to it. So Dorian is capable of things, such heinous things, that people kill themselves over it. And of course, Sybil Vane is an example of that. And Alan says to him, your friend Henry, Lord Henry, can't have taught you much about psychology. If you think that you can make me do this, whatever else he has taught you. So here we see that people who know Dorian well are also aware of Lord Henry's influence over Dorian, and the way he's turned out, and the kind of poisonous things that he gets involved in. Right, we're going to end this video now because the remainder of the chapter looks more specifically at how Dorian manipulates Alan into doing his bidding.